So now the dust has settled on DeepSeek, it's time to just take a quick look at why it mattered so much. So one of the big reasons it got a lot of attention is the market valuation and the market changes that happened with Nvidia's stock, I think dropping by something like 17%. And based on how much Nvidia is valued, that was a big dent in the stock market. And when finance is involved, everybody starts to pay attention. Hence, there was a huge amount of interest in this model that was coming out of China. And people trying to understand, what was it and why did it matter? So I think it matters for a couple of different reasons. The biggest reason in terms of finance is that a lot was predicated on Nvidia's pricing based on we were going to need a whole load of GPUs to train all these models going forward. And that's what Nvidia does best. They produce these GPUs that all the big companies use and the frontier models use to train their large language models. It costs upwards of millions and millions into the 500 million, close to $1 billion to train a frontier model. But then DeepSeek comes out, a research lab out of China, saying that they've done it for 5 million, including the cost of the GPUs and also the cost of the server infrastructure and the energy to run it. Now, some people say those claims are a little bit dubious and they might have used a lot more. If you actually take a look at the open source model and the information that they've given out and the weights that come with the model that they have released, you can see that they used a couple of different new approaches to making it more efficient to train. So one thing they did is they kind of beat OpenAI in their own game. So if you think about how OpenAI actually trained their models, whether they're saying it or not, they basically went through a ton of information on the web and certain corpus and information sources that might have been proprietary. Hence why you have, companies like Time that are suing them over potentially crawling their content. There was another interview where the CTO of OpenAI, Mira Murati, was fairly sketchy in her answer about, did you crawl YouTube videos to train the model? So OpenAI, hysterically, they were called OpenAI, then they became Closed AI. Now they're actually becoming a for-profit company in some form, which is very much different from their original ethos. And then you have this company come out of China, which is open sourcing absolutely everything and showing people how they've done it. And that put Silicon Valley in a bit of a flap because their moat, their defensibility was the inside information and how they train these models and how they produce them. So what OpenSeek in a roundabout way has done, one of the things they've done is they used a process called distilling. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but essentially what it means was they used OpenAI to help train their own model. So usually when you're training a very large language model, you have to have a huge feature set of questions and answers to do reinforced learning to train that. But what DeepSeek did is they basically used OpenAI's models to actually give the answers back quicker without having to go through such a large amount of a feature set. It results in a much faster training time and the costs go hugely down. They're also using a mixture of experts approach where normally when you ask a question into a large model, it has to go through a ton of what we call inference and thinking in order to figure out what the predicted tokens might be. So that takes a lot of server energy. In the mixture of experts model or the particular approach that DeepSeek took, I believe, again, I'm not an expert in this, they used a lot of routing. So they had many different models that were very good at specific things or many parts of the network. And when a request came in, they could route it to that specific expert. They didn't have to use the entire network and have to use a whole load of mathematical computation in order to reach the output. So again, that made it more efficient. And so what that means now is that before it was only the domain of huge companies like Microsoft and Meta that could train these models because it costs so much. Now the costs are significantly reduced for people to be able to produce expert models in any given domain. And that's really exciting, and it's really good for open source. And it also means it's really good for artificial intelligence in terms of its progress, because It was limited to a few large companies, and now, smaller researchers can work on projects and advance things themselves. Now, you could see that as a good thing or a bad thing in terms of AI safety. That's a completely different topic. So the last thing people are talking about is the safety element and the trust element of using this model coming out of China. So my take on this would be, generally, you should not trust any of the models that you're working with. When you're putting in any kind of content that might be proprietary, belonging to your company, or be personal to yourself, you just want to be mindful of what you're sending in there. Now, there are different privacy rules around different models. You pay more for enterprise models, which offer you a level of guaranteed privacy, but it's just good best practice to always question where your data is going. If you're dealing with a particular company, you don't know what API they're using to run their models and where that's going. It might go through multiple different chains, and you can't be guaranteed that your information is not secure along the way. So if you've got proprietary information, or if you've got passwords or API keys that are being sent into the model, you need to be changing them, and you need to be aware of that in your workflows. The other thing people are talking about is maybe it's okay to be passing all this information into the cloud because, hey, we can just take these models and run them locally. So what Deepseek has done is basically made it available for you to download an entire model if you've got a good enough computer and run that model locally so it's not connected to the internet. And this is fantastic. And there's going to be some great innovation with this kind of availability of reasoning on a local machine. But people think that that doesn't present any kind of a security risk because it's, enclosed in your own machine. The problem is that you can't account for how this model was trained and the information that it's going to pump out. We've already seen instances that, if you ask it certain questions about things that happened at certain time in the history of the Chinese state, that it doesn't represent those things accurately. So there's some censorship happening, but you can argue the same is happening with other models that are out there today. So you have to keep that in mind. So I guess you have to remember, as you have these conversations with these models, what are they inclined? What are their biases? How were they trained when you're using them? And you need to be aware of that, how it might affect the eventual outcome or application of how you're using that. Also, if you're using it for software development, is it recommending best security practices? Is it recommending these little packages or modules you should install in your program that aren't exactly the correct one, or they may be compromised in some way? I don't know. These are just guesses. If you think about worst case scenario, it's probably not the case, but we need to take these things into account and understand that if you're using a local model, there still can be security issues around that. So I guess there's a lot more to discover. I think it's all really exciting. It means some great things in terms of energy expenditure for using AI, and also the democratization of AI as well. And it's certainly shaken up Silicon Valley in terms of what happens next. So very interesting times in AI this week. If this topic is interesting to you, don't forget to check out the channel. It's under YouTube/Rob Shocks, and I cover this kind of stuff all the time, along with how to build stuff with AI.